Hi everybody, this is Poonam and I am here on behalf of DiGRA India, and I'm super happy to welcome Cody Mejeur and Mahli-Ann today. And they are going to present a lovely talk on diversity work that is being done in game studies. And I'm going to give a short bio of both of the speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Cody Mejeur. Cody Mejeur is Assistant Professor of Game Studies at University at Buffalo, SUNY. They have published on games pedagogy, gender and queerness in games, and video game narratives and player experiences. And they are currently the games director for Trans Folks Walking, a narrative game about trans experiences. They are co-director of the Palah Light Lab at UB and work with the LGBTQ Video Game Archive on preserving and visualizing LGBTQ representation. They are editor at One Shot, a journal of critical games and play, and serve as diversity officer for the Digital Games Research Association. Mahli-Ann is a final year doctoral candidate at the University of Sydney in the departments of Media and Communications and Gender and Cultural Studies. Her dissertation titled Gaming Life Words examines the ordinary affective dimensions of not coping and how everyday struggles animate the dynamic force fields, cultures, industries, publics, and counter-publics of digital games. She is an executive board member of the Digital Games Research Association, known as DiGRA, and she is DiGRA's former inaugural diversity officer and the past editor-in-chief of the Student Game Studies journal, Press Start. Welcome, Cody and Mahli-Ann. We're so happy to have you. And I guess we can start the talk now.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you for coming and attending the talk today too. Really excited for this.
Can everyone see this okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. I'm Mahli-Ann Butt. So, of course, I'm doing a PhD so I can get people to call me Dr. Butt, right? My goals in life are to become an associate professor to get people to call me Ask for a Butt. So that's my little intro here. You can find, I was the former diversity officer and Cody is the current one. You can find my email address and my Twitter handle here. And Cody, up to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the current DiGRA Diversity Officer. My contact information's on the screen. Our talk today is diversity work in game studies, and particularly the tagline, "How do we stop reinventing the wheel?" is one that we think a lot about, Mahli-Ann and I have talked a lot about before. It came out of some DiGRA Diversity Working Group work, and is really sort of a question of how do we kind of move past having just sort of diversity 101 talks a lot of the time, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. Did you want to go ahead to the next slide, Mahli-Ann?
So thinking about the way that we conceptualize diversity, I often find that this kind of idea of thinking through the differences between equity and equality to be really handy. And this visual kind of image really kind of paints that picture, right, as we can see here, where our concept of equality kind of might express having these barriers to entry or barriers to access or to be a participant in spaces where there is equal treatment, right? Here in the middle image, we can also kind of see what we might think around equity, where there's equitable treatment. So perhaps each person is given accessible, I guess. How would you describe this, Cody?
The middle image here, I think one of the things that is always really important to me about these images is that the different panels sort of deal with or don't deal with the fact that different people have different experiences and different needs for access, for inclusion. And so treating everybody the same, as sort of as good as that ideal can sound, it can actually not really address the inequalities that exist in a space, right? Different people will have different experiences. And you can see that in the middle image, there's equitable treatment in that, you know, different people's different needs are being met, as opposed to just saying like, oh, well, we treat everybody the same here and that's good enough, right? Because oftentimes that isn't good enough. Oftentimes that can leave people out, or, you know, it can leave the space being an exclusive one. And then, did you want to talk about the far right panel, Mahli-Ann?
Yeah, and as you can see in the last panel, right, where the systemic barrier has been removed. So this is kind of an imagined goal, right, that we are working towards when we're doing diversity work. There's also, I guess, within these three images, we can kind of see this idea as well, where, as we will be talking about in today, where diversity can sometimes be seen as if we are seeking solutions to problems, while sometimes actually that kind of approach of seeking solutions to the question of diversity ends up creating their own problems. Maybe not specifically captured here, but some examples would be when we treat diversity as a need to tick off boxes, as if we suddenly will get diversity, right? That we'll finally have an inclusive space where it's more of an ongoing conversation. And as we will also be thinking around, we're treating diversity as an ongoing question, right? Continuous work. So let's take a moment to also just define the ways that we are thinking about the term diversity work and diversity workers. So unashamed plug to Cody and the co-authored paper by me, Cody and Alana, which is published in Games and Culture, where we interviewed diversity workers in game studies as well. So we do define diversity work and use the term work to try and, I guess, capture more broadly an array of scholarship, teaching, and service that contributes to diversity. But also when we're talking about work, the way we've kind of discussed about this before and in our paper as well, is so that we are recognizing, or better recognizing, the often invisible, often effective, and often very much either unpaid or underpaid labor that goes in with diversity work. This is often performed by people who are deemed to be diverse people, right? And it's often relegated as work to people who are diverse. So this is actually, I guess, an issue that we've often thought about, something that happens when we've done this diversity work before and when we've done a bit of this research as well. So when we're thinking about the term diversity workers, or the people who do diversity work, talking with the interviewees for this particular article, we also kind of discussed around how, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Apologies, it's after 10 p.m. here in Sydney. So I'm thinking here, I guess, around where the term is contested, often contested, right? A lot of people who do diversity work might not necessarily consider themselves as a diversity worker or call themselves as such. Cody and I are obviously diversity officers for DiGRA, so there is a particular role there which solidifies that work in an institutional sense a little bit more. But of course, I think it is useful to treat these terms, I guess, fluidly, right? So thinking about the questions around where this work is often relegated to people who are deemed diverse, right? These kinds of questions also relate to the burden of representation, where people who are often more so thought of as diverse people end up having to represent diversity in an otherwise hegemonic institution. There's also something here about necessity to treat the term diversity work and diversity workers more fluidly, because it's often really difficult to disentangle diversity work from life. I remember there were some really great quotes from this paper from interviewees talking about how it was really difficult to try and quantify the diversity work that they did, right? This idea of what part of the work would be deemed as part of the diversity work and service or teaching, where it was, I think, if I can quote correctly, it's just how you live. It's just part of your life. Did you want to add anything to this, Cody?
Yeah, and Mahli-Ann, I love that you're dealing with like the, oh my God, it's after 10. I'm dealing with the, oh my God, it's 8 a.m. Like we have different versions of the same cloudy brain, I think, right now. But one of the things that really stood out in, I think, our interviews with diversity workers too was some maybe like ambivalence about the term diversity itself, like how diversity is a goal, right? Having more equitable and inclusive organizations and wanting to make sure that people with different experiences and different identities are welcome and supported in a space, but that diversity can also be a term that kind of gets tokenized in a way, or it gets sort of used by institutions as a way to like flag interest, like or claim or fake interest in wanting to be a more diverse organization, but that it kind of becomes like a buzzword, right? Like it's like, oh yeah, everybody's pro-diversity, right? And we love talking about it, but please don't change any of our policies, because we're not comfortable with actual structural changes or anything like that. But we can definitely talk about this nice word diversity, right? And so the diversity workers we interviewed sort of expressed a worry about that it was just becoming sort of a buzzword, but nevertheless that it's still a good ideal to try and put into practice. And I think that Mahli-Ann, you were referencing like kind of like the siloing of diversity work too, that we'll probably come back to maybe in like the Q&A and the more like sort of conversational part of the talk. But that seems to be like a really key current problem and trend in diversity work, is that it tends to get siloed in, oh, well, the people who are going to deal with diversity in race are the people who are studying race in games, and everybody else doesn't have to pay attention to it. Or, oh, the people who are studying gender and sexuality, those queer games people can handle that, right? And everybody else doesn't need to worry about it. But if there is going to be, cultural change and a really inclusive and supportive space, it kind of requires that everybody be invested in it to some extent, right? Like that it's not just on the one or two people or the small group to make sure that diversity is actually put into practice, but it has to kind of be like an everybody in the organization kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely right. Where concerns around the term diversity, I guess, being taken up and institutionalized, where it becomes more about paying lip service rather than the practices and the creations of policies and enacting them.
Yeah, or that it's that checking the boxes you mentioned too, right, Mahli-Ann? It's we need to have this committee that has these people of these identities on here, and we don't actually care beyond that, right? But like we just want to make sure that those boxes are checked.
Yeah, it's the well, at least we have one woman in this panel. Well, otherwise it's a whole conference full of men, right, and so forth. So I also just wanted to quickly point here, so the DiGRA Diversity Working Group was formed in 2015, and it's kind of just where members of DiGRA kind of volunteer. If you would like us to add you to any of these groups, we organize on Google Groups, through email, on Facebook and Discord as well. Whatever is most easy to be accessed by you. We really welcome everyone's kind of contributions. So as the former diversity officer for DiGRA, around the end of 2016, we did a diversity survey that we sent out to everyone in the list server or the members. And in this kind of large-scale study, we had, I guess we framed this study by thinking through how we might respond to some of the ways that people were being excluded from a lot of these DiGRA conferences internationally. And so the way that we kind of framed the analysis of this study was by looking at these 3 key points and how they kind of relate to each other and kind of inform each other too here, right? So thinking about creating policies and best practices by understanding, I guess, a framework of thinking about diversity or the key issues of that we're considering for, I guess, at least in terms of DiGRA, to think about diversity as a question of precarity, to highlight the embodied inaccessibility. So thinking about DiGRA as a conference where there are bodies and people assembling in a particular space. The concept of performative assemblies was really useful for this study by Judith Butler, and also which has been developed by scholars such as Sarah Ahmed, to think about the space that is created by the people who get to be there, right? And so also just thinking about where questions of diversity can include things like disciplinary diversity or virtual diversity, and the work of, I guess, representation that a lot of scholars do in games, which is really excellent, right? But it's kind of just a focus here on the precarious embodied inaccessibility in thinking about conferences, and how that then goes to thinking about the practices of exclusion, and by framing it in this way, being able to suggest better practices from it. So some of the key suggestions from that study that was published in 2017 was from the findings and suggestions from the community and members of DiGRA, was to implement sliding scale fees, revise the code of conduct, start up an ombuds program, suggestions of either creating a position or more formalized position of welfare or diversity officer, as well as financial or funding officer. The ones highlighted in orange here are the ones that DiGRA have actually implemented since. Some of these Cody has kind of taken up in more recent years, such as the Code of Conduct and Ombuds program, which they will go into more depth a bit later here. So sliding scale fees was really useful to try and make it more accessible for precarious scholars, since a lot of scholars in DiGRA are generally quite, I guess, there's a lot of students and early career researchers and a lot of scholars that aren't tenured. So, and also trying to make it more accessible for people traveling from different countries, right? Code of conduct was to ensure that that we would be more proactive in the ways that we responded to reoccurring instances, or to also, I guess, be symbolically expressing the core beliefs of DiGRA, and also being really clear about how things would be handled in the processes of that, right? And I think Cody will be able to speak more about the Code of Conduct and the Ombuds program in a bit.
Yep, that'll be coming up soon.
I also just wanted to quickly point to, I was earlier, before becoming the official diversity officer, I was the student officer for a few years. And when I was a student officer, we came up with some of the suggestions from the community to start up a DiGRA couchsurfing community and a DiGRA call for collaborations community, where the couchsurfing community was kind of a way where if you're attending DiGRA, you could kind of post and say, hey, did anyone want to share an Airbnb? And things like that to try and make attendance more affordable, right? So another key theme that you'll notice in this talk is Cody and I really advocating for developing more proactive approaches rather than reactive approaches, particularly since, as the question goes, right, how do we stop reinventing the wheel? How do we move on beyond the Diversity 101 talk and questions? Some of the recurring issues we already do know, right? In the past couple of years, we've been able to key into things that kind of happen again and again. So some of the key issues that we might be seeing again and again, so in the community for the Games Network, we've had instances of harassment and being targeted by groups such as Gamergate. And there's also a longer history in the field of game studies where there has been bullying, or what Amanda Phillips calls scholarly nagging. Did you want to add anything to that part before I talk about specifically the conference?
I think just really briefly, I would just say that, like, and I'll get to this, next, and talking about some of the things, some of the projects I've worked on since I took over as a diversity officer. But if you're on the Games Network listserv, I'm guessing that you have seen some of the more contentious threads, that would be putting it very diplomatically. Some of the really sort of heated and sometimes kind of toxic exchanges that have taken place on the listserv. And that was really sort of an impetus for some of the work that's happened recently, trying to, again, as Mahli-Ann said, get more proactive about these things rather than reactive, like waiting for, a really terrible thread to just sort of spin out of control for a couple weeks before anyone does anything about it. But like being more proactive about having certain standards for, how people communicate with each other. And not having those be super restrictive or limiting or punitive, but just have them, be premised on basic, concepts of respect and support, and things like that. Well, we'll still, of course, having room for lively debate and critical discussion. But anyway, like, so if you're on the Games Network listserv, you probably know some of these things that we're mentioning. If you're not, and you're on any sort of scholarly listserv, you may have seen something similar, but it's just kind of things that really sort of harmful exchanges that have led people to either like leave the listserv or communication platforms, or leave the organization entirely because it no longer feels like a healthy or a safe or supportive space to be. And that's sort of an ongoing issue that the Diversity Working Group and Mahli-Ann and I, as diversity officers, have really been trying to address.
Yeah, very much so, right? And I think part of the reasons why some people end up leaving Games Network listserv is feeling that because there's very little regulation of what goes on, and very, I guess, it's not really clear how interventions into stopping, I guess, certain threads from kind of plummeting down towards a certain, I guess, really toxic arena. I'm not sure how to even say it delicately, right? So there's, I guess, us working towards that proactive, trying to make it feel like people will be accountable in this space, that people can, that they will know where they could go to ask for some like what will happen if these things happen, right? Those kind of clear procedures. So just going to move over here to thinking about the recurring issues in terms of the conference. So in the past, sometimes I have given some consultation to the program committee where I'll, I guess, give some suggested best practices for best peer review process, you know, how to make sure that it's accessible and that it's kind and thoughtful reviews, that the reviews are, I guess, of a quality standard. So one of the things that we are working towards is, I guess, creating a document where that can kind of become, that can be given to each program committees each year, so that it's, I guess, just known what are some of the best practices, right? Also, generally for the international conference, there's the international board, which approves the bids for the local, where the DiGRA conference will be held locally. And then the local organizing committee often has quite a lot of freedom of how they want to run it. And obviously that makes sense. But sometimes it ends up being, I guess, that continuous discussions around the same kind of discussions again and again, of where the diversity working group will be working with the local organizing committees. Often, I guess, where once again, it would be useful to create, I guess, this document, a living document, of course, that has just suggested best practices. Because a lot of these, the ways that we know what are some of our suggested best practices, we kind of already know them. And a lot of them are actually quite easy to implement, right? So something such as gender neutral bathrooms and having them available, even just printing out a piece of paper that says these toilets have urinals, these toilets don't, can very easily give, I guess, offer gender neutral bathrooms for attendees. Would you like to add anything, Cody?
I don't think so. Probably most of the things I would say I'll get to in the next few slides with some of the other things we followed up on in recent years.
Yeah.
Which I guess I'll go ahead and dive into. So when I took over as DiGRA Diversity Officer in 2019, really a lot of what I've been working on is just building on the fantastic foundation that Mahli-Ann and others had established before, right? With the survey and sort of identifying the things that the organization needed to work on. And one of the most pressing of these was kind of the need for a code of conduct, which would be similar to what Mahli-Ann just said, ideally sort of a living document, but one that establishes really clearly what are the standards for, you know, for community conduct, really, in the organization. So prior to this, there was sort of a statement of values in the DiGRA Constitution that which was pretty bare bones. It basically just said, you know, DiGRA is an organization that values diversity and inclusivity, and like that's a really nice statement of values, but it didn't have like any clear, like, okay, but what does that actually mean? How is that put into practice, right? And the code of conduct was really meant to step in and clarify that, and also be part of that way of proactively dealing with some of the things like the listserv threads that were going really poorly, or at conferences. Another ongoing issue outside of the listserv was that at conferences, people had been made to feel unsafe, and as a result had written DiGRA off entirely, right? They were like, this is an organization where I can't even feel safe at the conference. I don't feel like my work is valued, and I feel like I'm being excluded. And there's no clear statement of what to do about that, or what are the best ways to interact with each other to avoid that happening. And so like all of these things led to wanting to establish a code of conduct. And I worked with the diversity working group on this, particularly Darshana, Allison, and I came together to do the main drafting of the code of conduct. We did this with feedback from the ombuds team, which we'll get to on the next slide, from the executive board, and from the diversity working group members. So we were trying to reach out to sort of these different groups within DiGRA to get their feedback as we were drafting, because our goal was really that this document would establish like clear guidelines and standards, but do so in a way that wasn't overly like prescriptive or wasn't like overly punishing, right? Like, because like that can also have sort of a stifling effect on an organization, right? When people feel like there's this long list of rules I have to follow, and if I don't follow them, then I'm going to get in trouble and be viewed as like, a bad colleague or something like that. And we wanted to avoid that as well, right? So we were trying to sort of find that balance of really clear guidelines that are, they're able to be put into practice, they're actionable, but that aren't overly restrictive and aren't punitive. A lot of the things that went into it were also guided by the DiGRA Diversity Survey and by some ongoing work that at the time Mahli-Ann and Alana and I were doing with interviewing diversity workers, really taking their perspectives into account for trying to make a document that wasn't just a nice statement or wasn't just that was able to be put into practice and actually addressed the ongoing issues in the organization, right? And so we really drew on the expertise and the wisdom of diversity workers to try and make that happen. And the code of conduct, I'll also put this into the chat too. Sorry, I should have done that a few moments ago. If you want to check it out, the code of conduct applies to DiGRA conferences, it applies to the larger DiGRA community and communication in that community, and it applies to the listserv as well. And that was there was a good amount of back and forth about that, because the listserv, interestingly, Games Network, well, it is de facto the communication platform for DiGRA, and especially for official communications and things like that. It's Games Network. It's not like DiGRA mailing list, right? So there was some confusion even about, is this DiGRA's official listserv or not, or is this just one that we happen to use? Or all of that was part of this process of figuring out exactly where this would apply and what it should look like. We can go to the next slide, Mahli-Ann. Unless, did you want to add anything about the code of conduct at all?
No, I think you got it all.
Okay, cool. So as I mentioned on the last page, for the code of conduct, we consulted the ombuds program. And I think that this was a process that setting up an ombuds program for DiGRA was something that going in, I had no idea what that meant, frankly. Like when I started it, I was pretty clueless about what exactly an ombuds was. And I've learned so much from working with professional ombuds on this program. Initially, like my only experience with ombuds was kind of the ombuds that you might see at universities or other academic institutions, where they're usually handling legal matters, or they're handling issues of like academic dishonesty or plagiarism and things like that. And they're usually, in those settings, ombuds are often really involved with sort of reporting structures and dealing, like if an issue of plagiarism comes up, then the ombuds steps in to help deal with that, right? And so that was kind of what I was expecting from an ombuds program for DiGRA, was that it would be part of the reporting structure, it would be part of, if there were ever any issues, like people had violated the code of conduct and had harassed somebody else, or done something like that, then the ombuds team would sort of step in and be the crew that helps address it and like cleans it up, right? And that was completely wrong. we put out a call to professional ombuds to work with them on setting up an ombuds program for DiGRA. And really quickly, they started sharing resources about what different ombuds programs can look like. And what we settled on was something quite different than that sort of reporting structure that I had imagined, and different in a really good way, I think. I'll put the link into the chat here to the International Ombuds Association. This is an international organization, ombuds all around the world, and it has pretty clear standards for what different ombuds programs should look like and how they should be enacted. But basically, an organizational ombuds program, it's for an organization like DiGRA.
If Cody's cut out, hopefully Cody can join us again momentarily. So some of the current projects here that we are working on include the, I guess Cody will have to speak more about the ombud structure for DiGRA 2022. But I think I already was starting to mention about these diversity recommendations for conference organizers and peer reviews, right? So just trying to, I guess, put together that living document that will just be easier upfront as like a package for best practices. Annually, we organize a diversity working group workshop. So as part of the conference, sometimes when we're not organizing the workshop, we also organize more informal luncheons, so the diversity lunch that happens at the international conference annually as well. For the workshop, we invite papers to be submitted on particular themes, but we generally also workshop the ideas of together with other members and attendees, thinking through how to, what kind of reoccurring issues are happening, or maybe current issues at that time, and I guess just thinking about interventions.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, hello, welcome back.
Thank you. I just saw Shuvik's message in the chat of like, did we get disconnected? I was like, oh no, it's me, isn't it? Thank you so much for stepping in. And where did I break off?
So talking about
the International Ombuds Program.
Yeah, and which part of the ombuds explanation did I get to?
So the idea was for the ombuds program, I guess, to be more of a reporting structure, but actually it's something else.
Yes, and just really briefly, the other thing that it is an organizational ombuds program is not meant to be part of the official reporting structure. It's not part of DiGRA leadership. It doesn't, directly relate to or report to any other groups. It is really it's an independent third-party organization that members of the organization can go to share experiences or issues that they're having and report those things to the ombuds team. And sometimes the ombuds team can, raise that maybe to the executive board or something and do so anonymously in order to protect the members, from if they're fearing any sort of retaliation, or if they're fearing that their, voices won't be heard. The ombuds, an organizational ombuds program is meant to be that safe space they can go to and talk anonymously. And if they want their, the issue to be raised elsewhere, then the ombuds team can help facilitate that. But it's not sort of the legal reporting structure that I thought it would be going in. And I think it's actually a lot better this way because it's very community focused and very much about being a safe space for the community to raise any issues that they're having without fear of any sort of reprisal or being ignored. I'm not disconnected. It all came through okay?
Yes.
Yes, great. Sorry. So I think probably can go back to the current projects. And you had talked about the first few of these, right, Mahli-Ann?
I spoke to the diversity recommendations and the diversity working group workshop, but not the rest.
Okay. Yeah, so now that the ombuds team has been up and running, and it's currently a team consisting of, I believe, 3 DiGRA members and 2 to 3 professional ombuds who are running that program. It's linked on DiGRA's website, and I actually don't have that link handy, but I can definitely provide it. But it's on DiGRA's website, and you can contact them if you have any issues with DiGRA as an organization that you would like to raise. The ombuds team is there to help with that. And can do so again anonymously, but they're working on setting up their structures for the 2022 conference, which hopefully will be in person, although that seems increasingly like a bit of a pipe dream, I guess, as the pandemic wears on. But they're setting up for the 2022 conference, which should be in Guadalajara, Mexico, hopefully next year. Another current project that has been kind of ongoing is starting some surveys and the process of maybe getting like a DiGRA United States or a DiGRA North America chapter together. It's kind of weird and conspicuous that the United States has, as many countries have, opened their own DiGRA chapters, including DiGRA India. Yay, fantastic. DiGRA, there's no DiGRA North America or DiGRA United States, and frankly, I mean personally, I think that there's something kind of imperialist going on there, where like Americans are like, we don't need a chapter because the international conference is our conference, or something like that. So, but this all kind of came to a head earlier this year when there was another sort of listserv blow up when somebody who nobody knew kind of showed up and decided that they were going to declare themselves sort of the head of a new chapter in North America, and nobody knew who this person was, and the way they were going about it seemed really questionable. But it kind of made DiGRA, I think, realize that not only is there something, a little presumptive going on about the US or North America not having a chapter, there's also maybe a gap there that certain bad faith actors might step in and try to fill and sort of like claim that as their own, right? That, oh, well, there's no chapter here, so I'm going to step in and do it and make it my own thing, whatever I want it to be. So we're starting that process of hopefully getting some sort of a chapter in North America set up. Mahli-Ann and I, too, out of our work with diversity workers and diversity work in game studies, are interested in hopefully building some sort of archive or repository or toolkit of best practices in diversity work. And Mahli-Ann, did you want to talk a little bit more about that? Or?
I mean, yeah, so we've been interviewing people and I guess like collating a collective wisdom of knowledge, right? This is, I guess, key towards going towards that proactive approach, right? Where we know how to suggest certain best practices. And I guess we're just thinking around now, interviewing and recording more interviews, speaking with more people. And I guess, again, kind of the similar ways of having these recommendations for local conference organizing committees and the peer review committees. I guess this will cover not just game studies academia, but maybe best practices as well for the games industry, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully it can just be a place that people can go to, right? Like I know that sometimes, especially if folks are just getting into this work, it can be kind of difficult to figure out exactly where to go to get reliable information and a sense of exactly how you set something like this up, like a code of conduct or an ombuds program or things like that. I know that I very much fumbled through setting up an ombuds program and was so thankful for the professional ombuds who kind of like held me by the hand along the way. But it would hopefully be a place that folks could go to find that knowledge in one place in a way that's, really easy to access.
Absolutely. Like working together with the diversity working group, I have learned so much from speaking with people, right? And so it's, I guess, paying it forward.
And the last point here on the current projects is we're just starting to work with the Diversity Working Group and then other organizations like the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, SCMS, on hosting some like workshops and programs to help support graduate students and early career scholars. I mean, especially given how daunting and frankly terrible the job market can be in academia, or even in adjacent areas and industries that people can go into, trying to set up some programs and things that will better support folks who are early career and are looking for something more permanent. They're looking for more job security. And so we're just early planning stages of that. But if you are interested in those sorts of things, please get in touch, because we're just planning out what those programs and workshops and support systems are going to look like. And I'm kind of excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, like I think developing a kind of mentorship program would just be so lovely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think finally, last slide, and then we'll get into, I guess, an open discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we want to include, and this is really, I should sort of say up front, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but we were thinking about, what game studies scholars, have really influenced our work and have really contributed in different ways, really, I think, to diversity in game studies. And so all of the individuals on this list have been really fantastic. And Shuvik, shout out to Shuvik, is on this list as well. And so many others, right? This is by no means exhaustive. It's really just sort of a starting place. But part of making sure, I think, that diversity work in games gets supported, it's making sure that the people who are studying different areas, from race to gender, class, caste, colonialism, like all of these different issues in games, the people who are like studying and creating the knowledge that helps us see those things better and then hopefully address those things better, really need to be supported. And that's part of the whole making sure that their work gets cited, right? And that it gets out there. And drawing inspiration here, I think, from Kishana's Cite Her Work hashtag that she started a few years ago, but it was really a call to especially cite women of color working in game studies or just in academia more generally, and make sure that you're not just always citing the usual suspects, as it were, or the same people who tend to get a lot more attention, but really looking to cite people who are doing important work that might not hit the mainstream or wider recognition.
And that's about.
Yeah, so that's all we had for like our slides sort of introducing and talking about some of these things. We were really kind of hoping to open it up at this point to something, a bit more conversational. If folks have questions or, particular topics you'd like to talk about with us. Yeah, that sounds great.
Poonam, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I was just speaking to myself. I was saying thank you, Cody. Thank you, Mahli-Ann, for the great talk. And as a new chapter for DiGRA, all of this was super helpful. And I was taking small notes, keeping things in mind that a lot of things that we also need to work on going forward. And yes, the stage is open now. People can unmute themselves or ask the questions in the chat box, and we should have an interactive session now. Shuvik, you were saying something?
And just to say that while they were sharing the slides, I put up the list of resources on our own website, so that anybody wants to find out the resources that kind of DiGRA diversity group kind of has, now can just also see them on the DiGRA India website as well.
Yeah, we have added that. We also have a code of conduct that we are working on. It's really nice. We just keep every other month or so, we look into that and we try to add new things. We always try to get as as inclusive as possible, as diverse as possible. Because India, again, we
Yeah.
are a huge country with like a huge
Yeah.
heterogeneous groups of people. So it's amazing, and
Yeah.
we're doing our best.
When I was growing up in the 80s, the government motto was unity in diversity. So we have so many official we have like so many official languages, so many regular languages, so many dialects, and of course, Cody, you remember I insisted that kind of we should also include caste in one of the and we did in DiGRA because that also kind of we have so many different kind of categories in which kind of there is diversity. So it's extremely important for us to understand what people are saying and to kind of respect so this was absolutely essential for us to start with anyway. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. I have a few, but I'll reserve them for later.
I think we also had a chat in preparing for the talk today of being like, we're also happy to do like any troubleshooting, right? If you had like questions in that way, if you wanted our suggestions or thoughts and things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shuvik, thank you too so much. You and others, the feedback that you gave on the code of conduct while we were drafting it was really essential to getting it to where it ended up, right? And was so valuable. Like in preparing for Mahli-Ann just said, we had conversations kind of getting ready for today. Like one of the, I think, really essential parts of doing this work, especially in an international way, is really making space for the fact that even like the same terms are going to be understood very differently in different places, right? Like race in the United States looks something different, I'm sure, than what race might look like in India, right? And then in making sure that like as you're trying to set up these systems, that it's creating space to talk through those differences. So like that's and that's certainly something that we saw making the International Code of Conduct, and I think is really key to doing this work in conversation with different groups of people. The other thing, Shuvik, your comment made me think about was our work has also started to look at the issues raised by the fact that internationally a lot of the work that gets recognition is almost solely done in English, right? As sort of the kind of like the lingua franca or whatever of academia, but the really sort of exclusionary results of that sort of trend as well, right? And I think one of the current issues and things to address is finding ways to like increase the visibility and the access of work that's not being done in English, right? That's really fantastic work that a lot of people primarily working in English might just not be aware of at all.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of work coming from DiGRA Japan and DiGRA the Chinese DiGRA chapter. But we don't know what's happening because of the language difference. But it's great that the chapters are doing exceptionally amazing. So even we are trying to put a lot of we have a blog, and we are trying to kind of put all as many as possible. We're trying to have a couple of articles in Bangla. We're trying to have a couple of articles in Hindi, a couple of articles in other Indian languages. So yeah, it's let's see.
Now the call for kind of posts in the blog is open, and we have just opened up to all possible languages really in India, and maybe with a little translation as well, so that international audiences can understand what these mean. And but I also wanted to comment here that as a result of the work of the DiGRA Diversity Group, not just the DiGRA conference, but many other game studies conferences the world over are now taking the translation of kind of non-English work seriously. And even during the peer review process on EasyChair nowadays, we get kind of instructions that there is a kind of place where you can indicate that you're not a non-native English speaker, and then kind of translations are provided often by conferences and so on. So this has happened actually recently. I mean, I'm like hoary and old now, so I've been around in DiGRA for a long time, and I've just been seeing this in a time when Mahli-Ann and Cody have been kind of diversity officers. So that's not too long ago in my long timeline. So well.
Shuvik, I think you might be overstating the case of being hoary and old a bit, but absolutely. But yeah, I'm excited for where this work is headed, and especially like that more and more people are getting involved with it. I think that's going to be what's really key to actually making long-term and sustainable change, is having more people who are involved in different ways in it, so that it's not just, you know, the diversity officer, or it's not just a small group of people that are doing that work, but it's something that everybody, well, not everybody yet, but, you know, like a lot of more people are getting involved with, and it's you know, it's people are more and more realizing that it's something that they have to pay attention to and incorporate in or at least consider in their own work in some way.
All right, so do we have any questions? Shuvik, do you want to go first and ask your question? You're muted, Shuvik, now.
Is it me, Shuvik, or is it Shuvik or Shuvik?
It's you. Sorry about that.
Right. So this is actually the only talk that I'm kind of at where there are two Shuviks, and only game studies talk. So usually nobody, there's no mistake really. But okay, so I'm a little curious about the representation of countries in Africa. For example, DiGRA was approached a while ago by WAGE, which is the West African Games Exposition. And I'm not exactly sure what transpired because my term ran out shortly after. But there was an interest in kind of like, you know, being connected with or represented by whatever, you know, what have you, with DiGRA. And that's I mean, one kind of, because we do have scholars who work in South Africa, like Hanli Gieser and Pipa Shabalala, who's written a bit but is not very active at the moment. So I was wondering if, and also I do know somebody called Kwabena who's working in Ghana, but somehow they kind of fall outside the radar of you know, game studies for whatever reason, although they have been publishing for a while. So I don't know if the diversity group would kind of, you know, think of, but then this is, of course, again, it overlaps with the chapter officer as well. But I'm just kind of a thought, really.
Yeah, Mahli-Ann, did you have any thoughts with that at all?
Oh. Well, Africa does have a really great games industry there, and there's a really great indie games industry there, I believe, right? And so actually, this is, I think, also would be in conversation with the international chapter officer, right? And I mean, I think also thinking around, we're talking about trying to reach outside of the Anglosphere, which is really, I guess, like, game studies is very, I guess, Anglo-centric. So, I mean, when I was at the Press Start editor-in-chief, we translated our call for papers into 15 different languages. And one of those languages was Urdu, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Right. So I think we could consider translating our call for papers into more languages, right, as well, as one of the things we could do. I think also the establishment of local chapters for DiGRA, I think we do have a move towards that now, right? Because when you're able to establish that local space, the local chapter, there's that kind of creating this like official and independent community that really fosters and I guess connects the international community in a really clear way, right? Like, I mean, this is happening right now, hello. And that's really excellent. Yeah. I mean, so we're planning to do a survey for North America, DiGRA, but we also had another survey that we're working on, which would be more of just like a thinking about just like internationally, like what countries want to start chapters, right? And actually maybe what we could be doing is with like a package of, I guess, like being a bit clearer about how countries can create local chapters, right? Yeah. I mean, so you've kind of, I guess, formed quite recently. What were the kind of things were given to you?
Well, we're still kind of, we haven't, we have asked for some help because for us, we are at the moment on a trial version of Google Workspace. So earlier we were moving from 40-minute Zoom to 40-minute Zoom to 40-minute Zoom if it was a 1 hour, 20-minute talk. So because if you look at how much Zoom costs comparatively across the world, then India is quite expensive, really, in comparison to the USA or even Mexico. Or I was just teaching this recently, so so it's kind of that. And again, plugging into that, also to talk about what you've just said about kind of the sliding scale of fees. That is very important for students from India, even academics, because a standard kind of package of an assistant professor is way lower than kind of you would even imagine, really. So for me to go to a DiGRA conference in Europe is like a month's salary plus maybe another half month or whatever. So, and can you imagine that for a student then? So this is at the moment, of course, the pandemic has its kind of devastating effects, but it also has some bright sides about the fact that there are many, most of the conferences have gone online, which is why there is a lot more participation from Indian scholars. You will see in the recent history of medieval games conference, there were so many, I think 3 or 4. So that's one thing, perhaps to kind of think of a different mode of kind of, conferencing as well. And not just kind of, I know that physical conferences are fantastic, and I really, really love to go out there and have a drink with all of you and kind of, but then that's a luxury that kind of, that many people here on this, they wouldn't be able to go to a DiGRA ever. I mean, for example, it was unthinkable for me to go to Japan because it was just way too expensive, or Tampere. Unless they pay for it, which, well, is nice, but it doesn't always happen. So you can see these are things that perhaps we think. And sorry, Mahli-Ann, just want to say that Zara, who's with us right now, but who's just had to leave, actually translated the CFP in Urdu this year, like a couple of months back for Press Start. So the CFP was translated by her as the second time round.
Yeah, thank you.
It's just left.
Yeah, I will say that, like, I think one of the things I would really like to see happen going forward, and I also want to keep in mind that the pandemic kind of threw a wrench in a lot of things, and people were pretty overwhelmed. So I think that, particularly Shuvik, going back to, you were mentioning, connections with scholars working in Africa, and this is, you mentioning that is actually the first time I think I've heard of some of those connections, and I think that maybe some of those connections may have gotten dropped a little bit in the pandemic, or historically DiGRA has also not been always particularly proactive sometimes about some things. So I would really love to see that return to, focusing on building different chapters being returned to. I know that there's been some resistance to more virtual or hybrid forms for the conference, but I think I completely agree that I think that having some sort of virtual track or like a virtual component to the conference, even if it is, primarily in person, would really increase the ability for people to engage with the conference, and also go towards that what we have been talking about in increasing the visibility of existing work, right? So anyway, like I guess that's sort of a long-winded way of saying like yes to everything you said, and I really would love to see us working on that more.
Because actually, I remember even before COVID, we were discussing the idea of having, I guess, like an online component to the conferences anyway. I remember that being like an idea of how great would that be, right? So, and also, I guess, a bit more around virtual presentations, right? And actually being able to do that, because I'm pretty sure that was just like, you can't present virtually, even though other conferences had already started to do that, right? I think it was kind of very difficult, and there wasn't really the infrastructure or the support for it to do that. And I mean, also a lot of these questions and concerns that are always, whenever we come up and being like, oh, it would be so great if we did this. It's also, I guess, the need for the labor and the hands to come in to actually pull everything together, right? And that's actually, I think, one of the main barriers for why things sometimes take a bit slower to kind of like come around and be implemented, right? Because there's just, it's really difficult to do some of this work when it's one person doing the work, right?
I think it also comes down to what you've said, really, and it's so correct that sometimes people who are from diverse, sort of sections are expected to do the diversity work. So if this is supposed to be diversity related, let them do it, and that's kind of that's so right, really. I mean, at least I've seen it in my experience. It seems to be relegated to. So that's also something that needs to change as an attitude, perhaps. And,
yeah.
One of our participants has a question. Orithra, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
So I had a question about diversity and conferences and stuff. So I was thinking that what are the kind of challenges and steps that are taken while while encountering topics of talks and academic discussions, which the basic format might be the topic might be about discrimination, but the example used might be very regional and local, as opposed to something global. So and also the diversity. For example, let me give a example that the example of caste discrimination that has been included in our our tenets of anti-discriminatory policies, where we have actually talked with DiGRA to include the caste discriminatory aspects that goes on in South Asian countries. So I was thinking, what are the kinds of steps taken to counteract these kinds of problems where these topics are very very localized, but then again, discrimination itself isn't a local problem, but the kinds of discrimination happen that are very regionalized. So my question was that what are the challenges that you come across, and also what are the kinds of steps that you take for counteracting these kinds of problems?
Yeah, great question. I mean, Cody, you were kind of mentioning about the importance of recognizing like local context, right? I mean, I think actually something important that we haven't really discussed as well is, I guess, very clearly around intersectionality, right? So the theory of intersectionality originally developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, and thinking about where, I guess, oppression and privilege. Actually, there's a great picture, I should have gotten it up too, which looks a bit like a butthole, to be honest, where it's all these different axes, right? Where we're thinking about the ways that like privilege and oppression kind of work in different ways, right? Where there is structural and systemic issues, right? And the kind of things that institutionalized, right? But these specific ways that they happen will be, I guess, unique as well, but depending on the circumstance, right? They're contingent as much as they're structural. There's kind of both going on there.
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic question. And like, I guess I'm thinking also about the need, particularly in dealing with like localized forms of discrimination, it is partially also an educational one in that oftentimes, well, not always. I mean, some people are discriminating like very intentionally and very knowledgeably, but I think a lot of what we see is sort of at international conferences is people who are acting in discriminatory ways that they might not even be consciously aware of, right? Like that they aren't tuned into, for example, discrimination based on caste, right? Because that hasn't been part of their personal experience. And I think this is why sometimes, like when people are pursuing diversity work, that one of the sort of common things that you will get in response to it is some version of, well, I haven't seen this happening, or this hasn't happened to me, so it doesn't exist, right? This isn't a problem. Why are we spending time on it? So I think that there's a real need to like raise visibility and also educate people about things that they might not themselves have experienced, right? And making it clear that, you know, just because this hasn't been something that you faced, it's still there, and, you know, it's still actively affecting who is or is not a part of the organization. My hope is that in starting to build out some of these resources, like hopefully like this archive of best practices that we're trying to, you know, pull together in the coming years, hopefully that labor of like educating and raising awareness and visibility isn't always on the people who are already marginalized. It should always do that labor, right? Audre Lorde, you know, writes about it always falls on the marginalized to explain their marginalization to the people who are marginalizing them, right? Like it's always, let me explain to you, you know, how this thing that you did was racist, or let me explain to you how this thing that you did was transphobic, or, you know, or something like that, right? And I think why those interactions can often be really frustrating for people is because for marginalized folks, it's always, you get really tired of that labor, right? Of constantly having to do that educating work. And so my hope is that as more people are getting involved and paying attention, and hopefully these resources become more available, that it takes some of that labor off of people having to sort of self-advocate and educate other people about things that other folks might not have experienced and might not be aware of.
I think somebody has raised their hand. I don't see their name.
Yeah,
Is
sorry.
that you, Prabhash?
Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello. Thanks for the wonderful talk. It was very helpful. Just because as we have just started this DiGRA chapter, I mean, diversity issues, as Poonam has already talked about, like India is a diverse country, and there are multiple forms of exclusion, and we would have to think about it in a very inclusive way, this chapter. So I had a couple of questions. They're not organized, and a couple of comments, so everything would be mixed. So I guess I'll just talk. The first major question that I had was, because this term toxicity was mentioned, right, constantly. So who defines toxicity in that sense in your group? What is the process of defining toxicity? The second one was, in case when you encounter a sexual harassment or racial harassment or some sort of, what are the processes that follow? How is the person penalized? Is it kind of just a ban which is so famous in game communities, but we can't, like, what are the procedures? The third one was, like you mentioned in your earlier comment, that the burden of marginalization falls on the marginalized, and they keep on explaining what marginalization is, and their scholarship is also limited to that particular area. So this would be a suggestion, I guess. When you in your last slide you talked about, like, cite them. So there might also be another way to encourage researchers, young researchers, to talk about issues that are probably they don't experience. Like men, most of the times in India, like probably when we are working on game studies, so there are no women. So there are no women. Do we address it? Do we not address it? So and I am not, like, there is no caste. So do we wait for a person who is from the marginalized community to talk about caste, or do we talk about caste ourselves? So these were a couple of things, and I mean, like, you can respond, and if something comes to me, I can talk about it. Yeah.
They're such wonderful, wonderful questions. Yeah, and thank you for that. I will have to apologize and very quickly say I am busting to go to the bathroom, and as an accessibility thing, I really have, like, I'll be like 10 seconds, I will be gone and I'll be back.
No
So I'm very sorry about that. But I do have a lot to say about everything you've asked.
Absolutely.
So do we address the question now, or should we wait till Mahli-Ann comes back?
Yeah, I guess maybe let's wait a few. That's a good point. Let's wait a few seconds until she gets back. I think these are really, really great questions.
It's like actually, Prabhas. I mean, I'm going to wait for Cody and Mahli-Ann to get back to you on that. But I also have a couple of things to respond to in connection to your second question, actually, in the Indian context, basically. And it's like, but I was just kind of saying that, and following from Oritro's question about kind of local issues, that what happens when when marginalized communities also practice exclusion. For example, I mean, the question of caste. I mean, I've just posted this Washington Post report, which I can't read myself because I don't have access, but it's about kind of IT workers in the Silicon Valley who are discriminated on because of their caste. And because on the one hand, there is this kind of notion that being not being kind of, hi, Mahli-Ann is back. I'm just going to quickly wrap up, but the not being from the country, obviously there is discrimination, but within the community itself, within the Indian Hindu community, there is also discrimination in terms of caste, really, and that just goes unnoticed until like so late. There have been IT workers in Silicon Valley from the 70s onwards, right? And it's kind of just like one particular caste or a few, caste anyway. So all of these just kind of like make it even messier and more complicated. But yes, to go back to Prabhas's question.
I'm back. Thank you for waiting so kindly. So I guess for the first one, it's really curious because I've, I guess, been thinking around the term toxicity, right? And actually, I am quite aware that at least within the circles that I am used to speaking about toxicity in gaming, it's kind of spoken about and assumed what that means, and there has, I guess, not really been unpacked that much, right? So the way, I think it's, even in the games industry, I've heard the term, right? It's kind of how I hear people talk about toxicity or toxic behavior. But I think it's also a loaded term, definitely, right? So the way that I understand it or hear how people use it more colloquially in casual conversation, it's kind of like where the term toxic masculinity speaks about how it's not all masculinity that is toxic. Toxic is meant to talk about where there is, I guess, some harm involved in some way, right? But that doesn't mean that all masculinity is that, right? That's how I understand it. What do you think, Cody?
Yeah, and I'm gonna preface my answer by saying that I'm sorry to hear squeak noise in the background. My puppy has decided it's time to play. I think that toxicity, it's an important term, but I think, Mahli-Ann, you're right that it's a bit of a loaded one at this point. Not to say that it's, like one that we should avoid or anything like that, but I think that toxicity, for me, I think really speaks to unhealthy or harmful behaviors that make people feel unsafe or like they cannot be in a space. Things that make people feel super anxious or unwelcome in a space, right? And those feelings can sometimes be difficult to pin down. And I think that that's one of the real benefits of having something like an ombuds program, is that even if, you just have sort of a general sense of like, there are things being said and done in this space that make me feel unwelcome and unsafe in this space, you can go and talk about that, right? Even if it's not something that you could isolate to, this person is harassing me, or this person is doing this particularly directly harmful thing to me, right? Because it might not reach that level. It might not amount to something that is like, no, this person is very, very clearly like there is a case of harm or harassment here that something needs to be done about. It could just be, something that is more in the culture or in the exchanges happening in a particular space. And an ombuds program gives us space to bring those things up, even if they aren't something that needs like direct action against particular like bad faith actors or things like that. And I guess like I'm kind of getting at maybe what was the second question about like what happens when like when people are harassing other people, or like when action does need to be taken. The current sort of reporting structure that DiGRA has is that like the immediate sort of go-to contacts for folks who are facing any sort of discrimination or harassment can contact either the ombuds program to talk about it anonymously first and figure out what actions, like does the person want it reported to the leadership? Do they want, some sort of action to be taken? Do they just want a safe space to talk about it? There's also the diversity working group is listed as a contact too, since one of the distinctions or one of the things about our organizational ombuds program is that as an independent sort of safe space, they're also not supposed to be like advocates. Like they're not supposed to advocate for particular things, but the diversity working group can. I mean, the diversity working group is a group of people who are usually there to advocate for things. So if people do want like action taken, they can also contact the diversity working group about that as well. And then if there are cases that needed action, they would then be elevated to being brought to the executive board to take some sort of action, like if somebody needed to be removed from the listserv, for example, or if even ideally the ombuds program can also facilitate like mediations as well, if they're rather than just going straight to this person needs to be banned. Sometimes that's necessary, but in other cases it can also be something like, okay, the executive board has been made aware of it, and now the ombuds program can help facilitate like a mediated conversation about it, and hopefully if it doesn't need to, it doesn't have to get to the point where it's banned or bannable.
I'm actually also thinking within experiences as well, where thinking about running a conference, where often something like a DiGRA conference, so in DiGRA Australia, for instance, it will be held, well, I mean, currently not right now, but like usually at a institution, right? Like usually at a university, and it's usually considered a public space. And DiGRA is generally considered like a public, like anyone can kind of attend if you register, if you pay fees. But where there has in the past been instances such as like stalking, right? So someone known to be stalking, someone presenting, and then there actually being really difficulties between Australian law where it's a public space, right? So for example, thinking around, all right, the university itself that it's being hosted at can be aware of these things, but it's a really difficult thing to actually ban someone from coming until they come, right? Until they break that code of conduct. So that's actually been an issue where actually thinking around where there is, guess, advocacy spaces such as the DiGRA Diversity Working Group, as well as, I guess, the ombuds team, and also, I guess, having a code of conduct that allows to mitigate those kinds of issues that do kind of come up, and trying to make that a more proactive rather than reactive, right? Because the law doesn't have it there in a public space. You have to wait until someone comes, and then therefore you can react. So that's kind of like some interesting tensions and issues. Yeah.
I just want to chime in here. As I said, Prabhash, I wanted to respond to the second question, and Mahli-Ann's response is like fabulous. In terms of Indian law, however, as far as the Vishakha law of 1997 against kind of workplace harassment of women kind of goes, and all educational institutions were required to set up what is called a CASH, a Committee Against Sexual Harassment. And now we have something called the ICC, the Internal Complaints Committee. And the remit is actually, it stretches to anybody who is on campus, whether it is an outsider or a member of staff or faculty staff or kind of like students or project staff and so on. So in that respect, basically, even kind of such kind of instances, let us say a putative instance of stalking, would actually come under Indian law and be prosecutable. Really, it could come under the ICC's remit to kind of initially kind of make a judgment on that, or it would just go to the local authorities. So that's the again with kind of caste and other issues, related issues, there is the Minority Commission, which addresses these. But that works on a more, I mean, there's also a cell in the ICC also, and there are also cells in the universities and education institutions. Even yours, if you are in one, Prabhash, will have that. All of these will come under the remit of.
The other thing that I'm just thinking about here as well is doing, I guess, diversity work and being in these spaces. It's really apparent the value of whisper networks and actually finding your people, right? And talking to the people who know that will have your back in these instances. I find that that's kind of this common ground that actually happens continuously. So maybe, for example, going to DiGRA, the international conference, right? You're still going to find your people there.
Thank you so much. Just two more questions, okay, Abby? Like, because initially the sense that I get that one of the frontiers that that everybody on the panel and everybody today here acknowledges, that we are confronted with structural racism, structural sexism and stuff. So most of the people, like the conferences that I have attended, most of the times women feel harassed by male arrogance, which doesn't go, which comes from a structural privilege. And how do we address those issues? Because here it seems like we are kind of waiting for some sexual harassment to happen, or happen in a very obvious traditional sense, rather than looking at, do we also include in our code of conduct those kind of things, and of like, because if we like the caste scholars that I have heard of, and the race scholars, they keep on talking about this swallowing of the pride, like just first swallow your privilege and then as an equal let's talk. But this swallowing doesn't happen usually, right? So one, I would like you to respond on that. Another one on a lighter note, it would be like, what about disciplinary inclusions? Is DiGRA also trying to form alliances with groups from other disciplines who might be intimidated to come here and share their experience with us because they haven't played games? So yeah, with that, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for some more excellent questions as well. So studies have found, right, so like Alison Harvey has a really great article that was published earlier this year, I think, which is about coping students, so higher education, game students, and I guess who identified as and used pronouns she, her. So how they coped with being in a male-dominated space. And I guess the sense of feeling that they had to prove against this assumption that there was like feminine lack, that girls and women and feminine folk are lacking in terms of games, right? That they're inherently bad at games or things like that. So they were always kind of fighting back against that. So in that article, Harvey does kind of conclude where, from her interviewees, that it was really clear how positive these women felt when they were given space that was for them, right? Where they didn't feel like they had to kind of prove themselves in that arena, right? In that way, where they could kind of, instead of survive, thrive, I guess, is how she kind of thought about it. Sometimes, like in the games industry as well, right, there will be really explicit calls of welcoming marginalized folk and people, right, and that they are welcome to be there and encouraged to participate, and that they will be supported and they are wanted. Because I think a lot of the time it's about not feeling like that people even want them to be there, right?
Yeah, that happens quite a bit. I mean, well, the game studies scholar sitting right here, so that happens quite a bit. Even with me, I mean, I've been asked quite a few times, do you even play games? Why are you doing research on video games? I mean, it's just a very frequent question that we have to, just deal with because, well, I guess that with that, I think we're done with Prabhash's questions. Does anyone have any last questions or comments? And with that, I think we would have to wrap up the conversation. It's been quite a long time. So yeah. Shobhik, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite late for Mahli-Ann. It's I think 11:30 already, and we've actually woken Cody up really.
I know. Am I like supposed to go be productive now, or like?
I'll have dreams about diversity. I guess there was that final note to end on the positive, right? About reaching out to like interdisciplinary work, which I guess we can arrive to there.
I also had a suggestion that all the authors that you mentioned, and I mean others as well, if we could put more of our work out in open access kind of resources that people could read, really, instead of kind of having them behind paywalls, this is so important. Perhaps something that DiGRA could do, the DiGRA journal could actually host something like that, basically, or some basic resources that kind of that would be helpful for many scholars who start out to think about diversity.
And I particularly liked that collaborations group that you have.
Yes.
That opens up a lot of venues. I mean, it's amazing for people like us, especially in smaller. I mean, the country isn't small, but the game studies scholarship is still kind of small. So it's really nice. I mean, I'm looking forward to it. Let's see. We need to collaborate.
Yeah, the idea has been really great, right? But I think it's perhaps been inactive in recent years. But I would love to get it going again, right? Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a community there where it's just the shout out of the hey, I've got this idea. Who wants to start a band? I mean, co-author a paper.
We've already made a start by overcoming the time zone kind of problems. Yeah. Sleep and kind of, oh my God.
Yeah.
So, thank you for such great questions, and thank you for having us.
Absolutely. It was our pleasure. It was so much fun.
Thank you so much.
Cody,
this is really wonderful. Yeah, I was just saying thank you for inviting us, and everyone for coming in for your great questions too. And if we didn't get to a question, or if you have questions, or if you'd like to get involved with any of this, please reach out. Would always love to hear from folks and work and collaborate with more people.
Yeah. Any last words, Shobik Mukherjee?
Thank you, all of you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, all of you who came and joined us on this wonderful talk. You can follow us you can join our WhatsApp group. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter. You can check out our YouTube channel. We post all of our talks there. We record, even this one is getting recorded, and we'll upload this in a couple of days, perhaps. And yeah, you can check out all our previous talks there, all our previous podcasts and ADDA sessions that we call them ADDA sessions. They're actually sort of roundtable conversations. And yeah, that's that. Good evening, good night to all the Indian folks here,
Yes.
and good morning.
Good morning, good evening, good night.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. Good evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day. Have a great day.
Have a fun weekend. Have a great weekend.
Have a fun week.
Yes, that works.
That works. Yeah.
All right. Have a good weekend, everybody. I'll see you later.